Hello my friends and welcome back. We are in the fabulous medieval city of Lincoln, about 155 miles from our starting point of the progress in Clerkenwell in London. Now, as you can see behind me is the grand 11th century cathedral, and this was Henry VII's intended destination, midpoint of his northern leg of the progress. He arrived here on the 23rd of March 1486 for the great Christian celebration of Easter. So before we get to what happened here at Lincoln over Easter, we should pick up our journey because if you remember, we left Henry at Waltham Abbey in Essex, but there were a few stops along the way before he reached here. The most notable of those was Cambridge. Now, Cambridge, as it is today, was a renowned university city. And although we don't know much about what happened when Henry was at Cambridge, we do know a little bit about perhaps why he visited. There were a number of reasons. The first of these is that Cambridge had what I call form, i.e. it had been visited by kings and queens in the past, notably Henry's predecessors, the Yorkist kings, and that in itself made a good reason for Henry to visit. He was going to assert his God-given right to rule. So the second reason is to do with Henry's Lancastrian forefather, King Henry VI. Now the Tudors would go on to aggrandise Henry's name on account of his piety and including lobbying him for potential sainthood. Well, that didn't happen, but that didn't stop Henry picking up the mantle of where his forefather had left off. Henry VI had put money into founding King's College, and we would see both Henry VII and then his son, Henry VIII, go on to pour a vast amount of money into completing King's College. And of course, if you visit today, you'll be able to see King's College Chapel, which is adorned with Tudor iconography. The third reason is that Henry's own mother, Margaret Beaufort, had close association with the university, so we can well imagine her encouraging her son to include Cambridge on the 1486 progress. So unfortunately, as I said, we know very little about what happened while Henry was at Cambridge. We know his stay was relatively fleeting, and according to the recorder who was travelling with the 1486 progress, once the king had left Cambridge, he travelled through the towns of Stamford and Huntingdon to reach here, Lincoln. This was one of the major stops on the 1486 progress because Henry had timed it to perfection. It was Easter, the 23rd of March, and Henry would have arrived here through the very gate in which I'm standing in now to be received at the great west doors of the cathedral, as would have been the usual fashion. So if you've followed any of my writing about Tudor progresses, you will know that usually the monarch would have been met several miles out of the town on the city boundary by the great and the good of the town, including the mayor and his brethren. Quite often the mace, a symbol of power, would have been handed to the king, who then would ceremoniously hand it back. They would then come in great procession to the heart of the city, and in this case here, to Lincoln Cathedral. The abbot would no doubt have been waiting by those great west doors. Cushions would have been laid on the floor. Henry would have dismounted his horse and knelt in an act of humility and piety upon the cushions while kissing the cross offered to him by the abbot. The whole procession would then go inside to hear Mass, and a Te Deum would be sung in great celebration of the arrival of the king. Now, while we don't have that level of detail for Henry's visit here to Lincoln, we do know a little bit about what went on during those Easter celebrations. So as I have said, Henry arrived here on Thursday the 23rd of March. This was Maunday Thursday, the first of the great days of celebration of Easter. And in fact, in the Tudor period, Easter was the Christian celebration of the year. So what better place to come to here at Lincoln, one of the most important northern cities, to celebrate this festival as publicly as was possible. And that's one of the things we do hear from the recorder's notes. Henry was not going to be squirreled away celebrating Easter in the private chapel belonging to the Archbishop here at Lincoln. Oh, no, 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 no. We know, and it was very publicly stated by the recorder, that the king processed every day into the cathedral to hear Mass in public. Yes, it was a chance for Henry to be seen by the people of Lincoln and to demonstrate that he was following in the footsteps of centuries of predecessors of kings as they celebrated Easter. Now, one of the first things that Henry did after his arrival on Maunday Thursday was, as tradition dictated, wash the feet of 29 poor men. Of course, traditionally, the monarch would wash the feet of the same number of poor men that equated to their number of years, i.e. their age. And so we have the 29-year-old king washing the feet of 29 poor men in the bishop's hall. Now we can take a good stab at where Henry washed those feet, because lying directly to the south of the cathedral was the bishop's palace, and in fact the ruins of that palace still remain today, cared for by English Heritage, and yes, you can normally visit them, although at the moment they are undergoing a period of restoration. And you can see the footprint of the two halls, the West and the East Hall. Now we don't know which one of those Henry VII used that day. I guess it's probably the larger of the two, which was the Great Hall, and interestingly, the same hall in which his son, Henry VIII, would dine with Catherine Howard alongside him during his 1541 progress to York. But that, my friends, is another story for another day. So as I've said, we do know that Henry celebrated Easter here at Lincoln in a very public and grand way. But while he was here, rather unsettling rumours began to arise that there was uprising in the north, headed by Francis, Viscount Lovell, and that he and the Stafford brothers had left the sanctuary at Colchester, where they had been hiding since the Battle of Bosworth. It was rumoured that the Stafford brothers were heading to Worcester to raise insurrection, while Francis Lord Lovell was heading to the north and was due to raise an army against the king and take him at York. This was a time for decisive action. And here at Lincoln, Henry sent out messengers to some of his most loyal supporters with a command to meet him at the mighty Nottingham Castle in the Midlands. And so Henry wound his way from Lincoln, first of all in a southeasterly direction. He was due to stay at Newark, but there was plague in their parts, and so he carried on to Nottingham, again being met by the great and the good of the town, about 3 miles south of the city. He travelled along the King's Road, passing through the gateways of the walled city, travelling through the centre of town, where he would have been seen by all the townsfolk in all his glory before arriving at the castle. The apartments that greeted Henry when he arrived at Nottingham were actually constructed by his predecessor, Edward IV. Edward IV had a particular soft spot for Nottingham Castle, and while much of the castle buildings was part of its ancient medieval past, Edward IV's range of lodgings were in the finest and most fashionable style, and therefore would have made very, very comfortable lodgings for the king. Now, once again, the Herald doesn't furnish us with a huge amount of detail about what went on at Nottingham, but we do know he met with George Stanley, Lord Strange, Sir William Stanley, and also John de Vere, Earl of Oxford. Now, it was no accident that Henry chose to rendezvous with those nobles at Nottingham. Nottingham had a mighty castle of formidable reputation, but strategically the town was also important. It was in the centre of England, and the town and the castle dominated a very important river crossing at the River Trent. It really controlled the boundary between the south and the north of England. And if you wanted to manage and control the north, then it was important that you controlled castles like Nottingham. Now, unfortunately, once again, the Herald doesn't furnish us with a huge amount of detail about what happened at Nottingham. We do know that Henry strengthened his forces during this part of the progress, and his nobles rendezvoused with the king at the castle. Clearly, plans were made. Although those nobles, interestingly, didn't continue on with Henry, they went off, obviously in different directions, with orders for the king to suppress the uprising. Henry stayed at Nottingham for a few days before he continued his journey north. This was to be the last leg of his progress before reaching the most northerly destination, which was, of course, the fabulous, the magnificent capital city of the north, York. Now, next time, I'll meet you in that city to conclude our story of the northern leg of the 1486 progress. We'll touch on a couple of the places that Henry stopped off along the way before showing you a little bit of my home city and the place that Henry held the magnificent Garter Day celebrations. I'll see you there.